Good morning. Welcome to the joint User Happiness and Tech Talk today. It's my extreme pleasure to introduce Marti Hearst from UC Berkeley, where she's in the iSchool. I've known Marti for more years than I think we should mention here, which means I have some great stories to tell, but I won't tell right now in the interest of time. But Marti's been working in, as you probably know, in search user interfaces for a long time now, and has the distinction of having invented a UI, namely textiles, which has probably been reproduced and re-implemented more times than anything else I can think of. So she's going to talk today about her book, Search User Interfaces, available here. And I want to give a warm welcome to Marti Hearst.
Dan, thanks for having me, and thanks to all of you coming out, especially on this holiday weekend. And I've, of course, a friend of Google, visited many times. I get involved with the Google educational missions, trying to improve teaching high school kids. I've been involved with Google's efforts to help women engineers, gone to faculty summits and so on. So obviously there's a very close relationship between Google and UC Berkeley. And of course, a lot of what you do here has influenced what I talk about in the book. So first of all, the text of the book is available free online because I wanted to make it as accessible as possible to people like graduate students, people in developing nations who can't afford to buy the book, but you people have salaries. So if you'd like to buy the physical book, please do. You could get it online for $40. Dan was very kind. He was very excited about this book, and he really wanted me to give an author talk about the book. Usually when I give a talk, it's on a more focused topic, and I found it very challenging to try to come up with a talk that wouldn't be dull and cover a whole book. I've made my best effort to pull out some highlights and try to focus on that. I will say I gave a talk here in 2006, I think in this room, on just one chapter of the book, although the whole book wasn't written yet, and that I spent a full hour on. So you can imagine that it's difficult to boil things down, and this topic isn't one that lends itself to lots of jokes, at least, well, maybe other people can do it, but I'll do my best to keep you interested. I'm not going to go through the entire book, but I just wanted to show you the chapter structure. It starts with the design of search interfaces, which in itself was a little radical because most accounts of search that talk about users tend to start with models of information seeking. That's usually the first chapter. And I decided not to do that, but rather give a summary of best practices, hints about what's working best now in search interfaces. And I summarized that in that chapter. Then there's a very long chapter on evaluation of search interfaces, and I got some input from people here, among other places, on that. Then models of the search process, query formulation, retrieval results, and query reformulation are kind of a trio of chapters about the main loop of search and search interfaces, and lots of details about that. And then a capstone chapter for that, supporting the process of search, what interfaces are out there to try to tie all the different pieces together. Then chapter 8 is integrating navigation and search, which is the talk that I gave here in 2006, which is actually in the video archives internally for Google. Then personalization, information visualization in search, information visualization for text analysis, and future trends in search interfaces. But these are the ones that I'm going to talk about some in this talk. I just want to give you the overview of the structure. And none of them in terrible detail, but just trying to highlight what I feel are somewhat interesting or compelling points. And feel free to ask questions or disagree or whatever. I can get my timer up. Okay. So the design of search interfaces chapter, I'm not going to go through all of the points there. Instead, what I want to do is ask you, the audience, since a lot of you are very knowledgeable about search interfaces, as some of the specialists of Google Search are here in the audience, to answer this question for me. Why is search difficult, and why is search easy? Give me some, if you had to write this book, what makes web search in particular, let's say, difficult from a usability perspective, and what makes it easy?
It's technically difficult to read the user's mind.
It's difficult to read the user's mind. Okay, that's great.
We're matching text.
We're matching text.
That answers both questions.
And that answers both questions. Yes, I agree. That's my point as well, and I'll elaborate in a moment. Others? I know this is sort of what you think about all the time, but if you have to sort of summarize it.
People that know what's impossible.
People know what people don't know what's possible, so their expectations are often unrealistic. Yes. Okay, some ideas there. Part of why I put this this is the first figure in the book, and this is an image that Jan Pedersen put together comparing the InfoSeek interface from 1997 with the Google interface on the same query in 2007. And the point he makes is, these are very similar. And why is that? Why does it look almost the same? And I use this illustration in the first chapter to talk about the importance of keeping the interface simple and what's difficult about search and why it leads to this simplicity of design, although, of course, we know that's changing to some degree. But one of the reasons is you have to support an enormous range of use cases. So if you're making, a word processor, the use case is people writing articles or people writing stuff, and there are a lot of variations on that. But all the different things people can search for, can think of, it's basically everything that people can think of is a use case for search. It's people's brains. And it's over an enormous collection of information of a wide range of types. So you're not just searching over brochures or articles, journal articles. It's more broad. Used by an enormous range of people of different ages, cultures, cognitive abilities, assumptions. And it requires reading, which is one of these things you can't really multitask. So some interfaces, if you can have more of a scanning or visual cues, it doesn't really work for when someone actually has to foveate on language and consume it. And of course, ideas can be expressed many different ways, and so you need to match these different modes of expression. But why is search easy? And this gets to your point. Well, on the web at least, the collection is so big that the same information is often stated in many different ways, at least if you're searching in English. And any technical difficulties, Dan? No. Okay. And so you're more likely to get a match given the variable ways people might state something. There's more likely to be a match than not. And also, despite the wide variation in what people look for, lots of times people look for the same things. And you can leverage off of that, take advantage of the fact that if many people make the same query, you can see what they click on and then improve results. And also, a very simple interface, along with very highly tuned algorithms, has proven highly effective for this wide range of people, for a wide range of tasks. So in a way, you get a pretty good result, a fair amount of the time, for a fair number of the use cases, for a fair number of people. So it's sort of a two-edged sword. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the rest of that chapter. I'm just trying to keep it interesting. The next chapter is the evaluation of search interfaces. I think this is probably the most valuable one for researchers and scholars because I spend a lot of time on it, and I have a big focus actually on what not to do wrong because there's so many ways to go wrong when evaluating search interfaces. So I'll highlight a few of the points here. First, just a summary of the major evaluation techniques, which most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. So when you're first designing a new interface, you do informal, low fidelity, discount usability testing. So you don't do a big formal study, you just see if people can't understand it at all and don't do anything that you thought they would, and if that's the case, you start over. Once you're past that point and you have a more usable design, you can do formal laboratory studies or formal studies where you compare things with a set of participants, balanced design, and try to determine what works and what doesn't for a somewhat narrow range of phenomenon. Then there's field studies, which Dan Russell and his team does a lot of, where you actually go out and watch people in the field, whether or not the field is indoors or not, using their designs, seeing sort of what you call ecological validity in the social science literature, what people really do when they're in their ecology, and that can be a lot different than what they do in a lab, which is artificial. And then longitudinal studies, which I want to focus on a bit, because that's become not super popular, but I think it's an important direction to go in, especially for more academic studies that hasn't been focused on in the past. So I'll give an example of that. Then log file analysis, where you study what people click on based on what they query. And of course, what's very popular here and at major search engines, large-scale testing. So showing the two different interfaces to the very large audience of thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands of users, and determining automatically what the difference is in responses to those different designs. This is also called A/B testing, bucket testing, parallel flights. It's proven very powerful way to improve search interfaces. but is only available to those who have very large interfaces to test. So others need to resort to other measures. So I want to talk a bit more about longitudinal studies, which just means doing a study over time and letting the same users use the interface. And one study that I'm quite fond of is the Findex study done by Ann Alla and Mika Kaki, and Ann is here in the audience. This study was done on a clustering interface, but the interface itself doesn't matter that much. What I really want to emphasize is the way that things were done. Basically, users were asked to use the interface over a period of several months, and their interactions with that interface were logged, and qualitative measures were taken both at the beginning and the end of the study. So they were surveyed for their responses towards the beginning and towards the end, and then they were able to measure how those responses changed or didn't change over time. So one of the things that happened was that the subjective opinions improved over time. So the initial reaction often to a new interface is it's unfamiliar, people have to learn something, and so it's not as favorable as it might be as they become more familiar with the interface. Often the opposite happens as well, especially with visualizations, where the initial response is, this is really cool, this is really mind-blowing, but I would never want to use it over the long term. So you see both directions, and by doing a longitudinal study, you can measure those differences. Also, the participants started to notice changes in their search habits that they were able to articulate. Some of them articulated them explicitly, others were articulated in the logs. And again, that wouldn't be possible with just a quick lab study, and it's a little harder with sort of anonymous, very large log studies as well. So here's just a graph from their paper where the details don't matter so much, but what I want to show is just how the numbers changed after 1 week versus after 2 months, the big shifts in the qualitative responses to agree or disagree for different aspects of the interface. And when you just do a snapshot after the initial use, that's not going to be necessarily realistic for the long-term view. So I've been encouraging in my teaching and my talking, I've been encouraging people to consider longitudinal studies as a good interface paradigm. Oops. Okay, some other evaluation essentials. It's important to match participants to tasks. So I've done a number of usability studies for search interfaces and had some kind of amusing anecdotes. So, for example, we were developing faceted navigation, and we started with a recipes collection. So we recruited people that like to cook. And that worked pretty well, except for one participant absolutely hated the interface. He hated all the interfaces, and it turns out he hated recipes, hated them. And we were having him browse over a recipe collection, and so that was not a close enough match to the task. Another example, we were testing this Cha-Cha interface, which I would consider to be the predecessor to deep links that you guys show in search results now. We had students look at search results on the Berkeley campus embedded in the various departments, and they really weren't that thrilled by it, but even we deployed the system anyhow, and it turned out that the campus administrators really loved this interface because it put search results in context of the campus, and so it just turns out undergrads don't really care about the context of the campus and the various administrative posts. So it's very important when you are working with a small number of participants as opposed to log studies to match the participants to the task. It has to be meaningful for them in order to get a realistic result. Also, participants should be highly motivated. So if you ask somebody to use a search interface that makes them choose among camera lenses and they find that topic stultifying, you're not going to get a very realistic result. So one technique is to offer users participants in a study a choice of different tasks, and they're requested to pick a subset of them for the study so that they can pick ones that interest them in particular. Another technique that I like a lot is advocated by Jared Spool, who is testing out e-commerce websites, and he wanted to be sure that the participants were really motivated to complete the task well. And so what he would do is bring them in and tell them, okay, I'm going to give you $75 to buy something on this site. You can't have the money, you've got to buy something. And so think about what do you want to buy on this site. So they think about it, and then he's like, okay, go home, come back in a week, and we'll talk. So that they come back a week later, they've been thinking a lot about how they want to spend that $75. So he claims he even offered them the cash, and they said, no, I want to do this search and buy this product that I want to buy. Now, I don't know if that's really true, if they use the cash, but so he claims. But the point is, getting people highly motivated is going to more realistically mimic the real search task. And it's very often not done in search evaluations. There's a bunch of statistics, both Jakob Nielsen talks about this and also in the Trek evaluations, that there's often more variation across one system and one system across tasks than there is across systems. And so if you're comparing two systems on a few tasks, you're not going to get very reliable results. You really have to run an evaluation on lots and lots of tasks. And there's some interesting ideas out there in some of the more recent studies, notably this Woodruff et al. Paper and the Bowdish et al. Paper, on sort of dividing the tasks into different types and then evaluating how the interface does on those different types. And I think that's probably the way to go. And just actually recognizing that your design might only work on certain task types. And of course, differences in cognitive abilities of individual participants can be a better predictor of performance than differences in systems. So it's very important to get your experimental design right, so you're varying who does what when. And there was a famous example at the Chi conference that this always brings to mind, which was they were comparing just a regular file browser to Xerox PARC had this WYSI hyperbolic tree browser, and then there was a third one, and the hyperbolic tree browser won. But I remember noticing at the time that actually it just seemed like Rhonda Rao and Pete Pirelli knew more of the answers than the other people, and they knew where to go in the directories, and that's why they won. And in fact, they did a study, as Pete did a study after that confirmed that. So you really have to be careful with these comparisons. Another one is don't evaluate your own design, if possible, because you're biased. Now, in academia, it's very hard to get someone else to evaluate your design. I think in industry that happens more. So if you do evaluate your own design, you shouldn't leak which one you think is best. And there's lots of ways of doing that. So people often say, we're testing our design. What do you think? So you can state things neutrally without misleading. So you could say, we are assessing these designs, as opposed to we designed this and are now assessing it. You can use generic names for the different designs. If you give a really jazzy, fun name to the new design and a boring one to the baseline, that can bias things. So we recommend using names of mountains or streams or colors. You should have a strong state-of-the-art baseline to compare against. I can't tell you how many studies I've read where someone has their WYSI design and then they compare it to showing URLs with no titles or something, very unfair baseline and to try to make their results look better. You should use the same collections for each design because often people can't implement an interface on top of a standard collection, but that's not a fair comparison. And you should make all designs aesthetically pleasing. There's a lot of evidence that shows people are biased against ugly designs, but sometimes people do make the comparison unfair that way. Okay, now I'll talk a bit about jumping to Chapter 6, query reformulation, but what I want to do here is talk about some important principles, cognitive principles, that play into this part. So one of these is, I'll go through these a bit. So there's recognition over recall, multiple means of expression, also called the vocabulary problem, anchoring are the three major ones. And both modern query and query formulation aids address these, as does modern site navigation and search aids. So let's talk about each of these three a bit. So recognition over recall, it's easier to recognize information than to generate it yourself. So we've all experienced this when learning a foreign language. It's a lot easier to hear someone speak the language or read it than it is to generate new sentences yourself. Similarly, it can be easier to recognize a face than reproduce it or draw it or something like that. We're very good at recognizing things. It's harder to generate them ourselves. And related to this is multiple means of expression. So people remember the gist of what you said, but not the actual words used. So can anyone say how I described recognition over recall on the previous slide? What words did I use exactly? Probably not, but you can probably remember what were the examples that I used. What were the examples, do you remember, Peter, about recognition over recall? The general essence. Sorry, I'm not trying to. I don't want to call it, well, but you could pretty much remember the gist that I used learning a foreign language as an example, and you put that in other words. Okay. And there have been studies showing that people can agree on the meaning of a label even if they don't generate the same labels to describe something. So there's this famous study by Hearst et al. Where they had people try to name things. This is what we use for card sorting for as well. So name, what would you put the names for various editing commands? Or if you had an object, what would you name it? And you get very little uniformity in what choices of words people use. Here we have 0.11 and 0.12 overlap across all of the participants in these studies. But if you actually pick the most common word that was chosen for each category and then show it to people, the recognition is very high. So these things are not symmetric. The generation versus the recognition, it's not a symmetric phenomenon. And we can exploit that in search interfaces. The vocabulary problem is another way people talk about this. So there are many different ways to say the same thing. And so I've listed, just off the top of my head, different ways you might say, how much does that camera cost? Or how much for that camera, how much? What's the price of that camera? Please price that camera for me, and on. And this is just using full sentences. So the interfaces need to help people find alternatives if the way they're expressing information doesn't match the way it's out there, or generate these in the matching algorithms to match the original way people state things. And then the last problem is anchoring. And I don't know if any of you have read Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. I recommend it as a fascinating book about how, primarily really about how money influences society and changes behavior. And there's a lot of fascinating details about how people react in this book. But one of the anecdotes is if you tell people to think of the last 2 digits of their social security number and maybe write them down, and then you give them some objects to bid on, some money to bid on, those who have a higher couple of digits at the end of their social security number bid higher numbers than those who have smaller digits in the last 2 digits of their social security number. That there's this priming effect, also referred to as anchoring in these cases, that influence how people think. And there's all sorts of cases like this. It's fascinating. So we could see a similar phenomenon in search. So if people start with a few words, it's very difficult to break out of that set of words to come up with alternative ways of expressing things if they don't have any aids. And Dan Russell has this example that I took and put in the book of someone who wants to know how many copies of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince have sold and is not having any luck with lots and lots of different rewordings of this. Now, I think probably query reformulation isn't enough for this person. They probably need to be led to a collection of statistics somewhere and then search within that, is my guess. But the point is, this person's trying hard and the rewording isn't working for them. So query suggestion aids have become pretty mature these days, and they're often machine generated. But in the old days, when people were experimenting with this, the systems often computed machine-generated suggestions from text collections. And they showed a very large number of terms to the user before showing search results and said, maybe they'd show 40 terms with checkboxes, required the user to check a whole bunch of them, and then they would rerun the query. And that didn't work out so well. The usability of that was pretty poor. The newer, more modern view is to just show a few suggestions with a hyperlink, so you click on one suggestion and that brings back results. So it's really like doing a reformulation in one step. Also, the queries are often generated from other users' queries, and there was a recent study, SIGIR last year, by Diane Green and her associates, showing that at least for their algorithm, the user-generated queries were better than the automatically generated ones. So we haven't necessarily come up with algorithms that do better. Now, maybe you guys have, and it'd be interesting to know about that. And they have pretty good uptake, about 6% usage of the statistics that I could find on search engines for the web. And so both dynamic query suggestions shown while the user is issuing their query and static ones shown after their query has been issued seem to have good usability from the literature, at least as much as I can find. So here I have a Netflix related queries where it's a specific domain, movies, and so this kind of matching can be very helpful for matching the first couple letters of the word BEI I have here. I've also liked this variation I've seen at the Next Bio site where I typed the 3 letters EMB, And what it does here is it puts the suggestions in context. So we have compounds that match this, genes, I guess just compounds and genes, and tissues. So kind of categorizing the matching terms by technical areas. And I think that's a very promising approach for more technical interfaces. And of course, there's post-query suggestions, where this is after a query on Yellowstone, we see both kind of categories that have been predefined as well as user queries that match. And there's a lot of variations on this. And by the way, I should say that in the book, I really emphasize backing up the assertions I make with quotes from the literature. So there's more than 600 references in the book, and I really, in earlier days when I wrote a chapter about search interfaces around 1999, I was basically listing what people were doing, and I couldn't really say what worked or what didn't. The emphasis in this book is taking the empirical evidence and using that to back up claims. So although I don't have citations all over these slides, I'm really making assertions that are supported by the literature. Another kind of recent piece of work, which you folks might not be that familiar with, is this suggesting destinations idea that Ryan White et al. Did at Microsoft Research, where they recorded search sessions for hundreds of thousands of users in their toolbar. And they didn't just look at what they clicked on right after the search, but they followed their clicks throughout for that query and for the session. And they found, for example, that users generally browsed very far from the search results page. They went out 5 steps on average. And furthermore, they visited 2 unique domains during the course of a query trail and just over 4 domains during a session trail. So they distinguished between, for a given query, how far out people went, and for a given session, so about 5 minutes of usage, how far out they went and where they went. So that was pretty interesting, because I think to that point, people really didn't have evidence that people were going across lots of different domains, by which I mean web URL domains within a session. And so then what they did was they picked the endpoint for these sessions, and they showed them right in the search results. So if someone searched on space, for example, they would show the Hubble telescope as a potential hit. And they actually found that that was quite effective, and these were used more often than query term suggestions, standard query term suggestions, and they had, in a large number of the cases, high satisfaction scores. So this is really using user behavior to go beyond the standard query term suggestion, but to, in a sense, try to read people's minds and what people, in the general case, try to do. It only works for queries that are really common, however. So if the queries vary a lot, you don't really know what the right trail is to show. And then showing related documents, the kind of more like this function's been around for a long time. It's still not clear what to do for web search, but it has been shown useful for more focused search, such as on the Medline system for journal articles in the biomedical field. They use a probabilistic algorithm to show related documents, which I think makes use of the links, the references, as well as the terms in the abstracts. And they found this is quite a popular feature. It's quite heavily used at PubMed. So the question is it possible to generalize this to more general search? And then there's relevance feedback, which, for those of you who know the literature at least, it's a very popular topic in the ranking community. People have talked about relevance feedback for years. The main idea is someone does a query, they get some results back, they mark a whole bunch of the results indicating which ones are relevant and in some cases which ones are not. Then that information is used to reweight the query terms, do a new query, and get a new results list. And it's been shown in fully automated search situations where you have a query automatic, relevance feedback automatic or not, and then another results list. Then if you look at the precision or recall of that results, you can improve the results dramatically. But it doesn't ever seem to get used in practice, and the question is, why is that? Well, first of all, it works best for tasks that require high recall, meaning you have to have lots and lots of relevant queries, because in the task for which relevance feedback was used, the assumption was you wanted 1,000 relevant documents if possible, as opposed to the high precision types of queries we see on web search. Also, the results are unreliable, and throughout the book I point out this fact that, at least for search and probably for a lot of other interface situations as well, unreliability in the quality of the response is seen as a negative to users. They'd rather have it be simpler and reliable than complex, sometimes helpful, but unreliably so, and sometimes very poor. And so you often get punished when you try to do something that has unreliable results. But most importantly, relevance judgments are just difficult to make. It's cognitively tasking. Having to select lots of them is even harder, and a lot of the relevance feedback requires that. And it turns out that the less you know about a topic, the less you can recognize relevant documents, and the more you would need relevance feedback. So it backfires that way. So it hasn't really taken off. Okay. I'm not going to talk a lot about integrating navigation and search, except for that it is kind of a favorite topic of mine, since the flamenco approach to faster navigation is what we've been promoting for the last 10 years. But just a few key points is showing users structure as a starting point rather than requiring them to generate queries takes advantage of the recognition over recall idea. And this is most appropriate for website search or collection search. I think it's very hard to achieve this in web search as a whole. You organize results into a recognizable structure that aids both in comprehension of the collection and suggests where to go next with the collection, and eliminates empty result sets, which is really, empty result sets are very bad from a user's response for search, one of those principles that you want to avoid. And there's different techniques, flat lists of categories, faster navigation, and document clustering. And again, I gave a talk on this about 3 years ago, if you want to look it up in the archives. Okay, now a little bit about visualization and search. And I again want to put a question to the audience, which is, will visual search ever succeed? Why isn't Google search fully graphical right now? And so before I say my thoughts on that, I thought I'd get some of your thoughts. Why isn't Google search graphical, visual, pictures? Yes?
Because we can't really have a rich conversation with the search engine right now, and trying to convey what we're looking for.
So we have a rich conversation with the search engine?
We don't have the capability for a rich conversation to describe what we're looking for. And so in turn, it's hard to guess what we want. So it goes back to the original problem of not understanding.
So it's hard to guess what people want, but that doesn't necessarily explain why it's not graphical or why it's not visual, right? That's more about an interaction, dialogue kind of thing. Is that back there?
It's more difficult to package information onto the screen as a single linear list.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you at all.
It's more difficult to package information onto the screen as a single linear list.
It's more difficult to pack a lot of information on the screen visually, but isn't a picture worth 1,000 words?
That's the problem. It's worth 1,000 words. So any picture that you show can be interpreted in many, many more ways, probably, than a simple text snippet.
A picture has lots of different interpretations. It's sort of mysterious, maybe, what it's suggesting is behind it, you're saying. Yeah, I think that's definitely the case a lot of the times. If you show a picture of a cat, what does that mean? What is that representing? Other reasons? I have my stab at it. So one is, I mentioned before, reading requires full attention. So if you do show text, it's hard to also make it graphical. And if you show images next to text, there's a cognitive switch that has to happen. When you process text, that's a different set of mental activities than processing images. Reading is not pre-attentive, and I'll explain that in a second. And you can't graph nominal data on axes. So let's talk about these two. So pre-attentive properties, which is what visualizations take advantage of, are those properties where humans can recognize without having to do serial scan. They can tell in parallel, typically under 100 milliseconds, whether or not a property holds. So in this case, even if we have a very large field of blue dots, or of dots, people can determine under 100 milliseconds whether or not there's a red dot in that field. So color differentiation is a very powerful visual indicator, and that's why highlighting with color when you don't have too many colors is a very effective visual interface trope. But and there's other sorts of things that are pre-attentive, like one angled item, maybe angled horizontally in a field of vertically angled images. Interestingly, if you combine properties, often they're not pre-attentive. So a picture like this, where you have circles and squares that are red and or blue, it's hard. You can't pre-attentively recognize if there is a something that is both square and red in this field. So you still have to do the serial scan. But text is not pre-attentive, so I'm going to flash something up, and you tell me what's interesting about this text. Can you tell me? I gave you more than 100 milliseconds. Okay, you couldn't. Now, I'm cheating a little by using all caps, but it turns out now if I leave it up longer, can people see the pattern?
Mirrored?
Yeah, the first half is mirrored, is written kind of forwards, and the second half are the same letters written reversed. If text were pre-attentive, that would just jump out at you, but it's not. You really have to foveate on it and read it. And so anytime something is text, you're not going to be able to have that at-a-glance effect that you get with visual search. Also, if we look at quantitative data, simple quantitative data anyway, is easy to visualize. So here I have this classic set of data about autos from the 70s, where I've plotted miles per gallon against the year of the auto, the make of the auto, and then against a nominal attribute, which is what country makes those cars. So we can see in the 70s that the miles per gallon for the U.S. cars were way below those of Japan and Europe, and they were kind of fighting with each other over this. But if you want to plot nominal data, which is what text is, where there's no inherent order to it, except alphabetical order, which is an artificial ordering, doesn't have a meaning. Just because something starts with A and then something starts with B, there's no real meaning for the B to come after the A. So you could get nonsensical plots if you try to plot nominal data. So here I've put miles per gallon again, and the color still represents which country. And on this axis, I've put the name of the model. And so there's these different cars here. So I have an AMC Concorde D6, whoops, and there's Cadillacs and so on. And so you kind of see this graph moving up and down, but it doesn't mean anything because there's no inherent order to models of car by their name. And when people try to visualize text, that's pretty much what they want to do. And it doesn't make sense to put words in some order like it does numbers. And so we end up seeing lots of visualizations where people put things in tables, but the axes tend to be the year the article was published and maybe the number of citations that it has. And that's not that useful for search. That's just useful for people stocking library shelves or whatever. So it's very difficult. Now, there's one area where it's still a question is showing images of pages. At least it's a question in my mind. So most of the studies suggest that showing images in search results, where it's sort of a shrunk down version of the page, doesn't help and in fact can hurt results. This was one study where they did a comparison, but it's not a very fair comparison because they kind of compared having the titles to having the images and no titles to having both. But when they had both, they found that participants were more likely to assume the document was relevant whether or not it was. So kind of an odd result like that. And also it took longer to have both, which other studies have echoed, which may or may not be a good thing depending on your metrics. But in another study, where this was more remembering layout of pages, they found that blank squares were just as effective as showing the thumbnails, although the subjective ratings for the thumbnails were high. So as I was working on this part of the chapter, I was pretty much saying thumbnails don't work well, but there's these other points. So first of all, people love visualness. They like seeing images. The technology is getting better, and I have a screenshot of Search Me in a second. Then people have found, well, if you make important text larger, that makes the thumbnail more useful. But the most important thing that I came across recently that was changing my mind was that earlier studies may be using thumbnails that are too small. And so people were looking at the colors. They weren't really using all of the relevant cues. And so I think the jury's still out on thumbnails. And then showing figures extracted from documents can be useful, which is a little different than a thumbnail of the image. But if a document has figures that are meant to be seen in isolation, that can be useful, and we've done some studies on that. So here I have a picture from Woodruff et al. Where they did some clever techniques to make the query terms sort of stand out from the thumbnail, and these are 4 different types of tasks. And this is our biotext search engine where we have very rich search result summary information, which the user can control, but we pulled out the figures so that it's easy for a scientist to differentiate an article about zebrafish that shows pictures of zebrafish cells versus one that shows graphs versus one that shows skeletons. And it can be useful in this context. And then, of course, there's, in the old days at Xerox PARC, they had the Web Voyager tool where you could flip through virtual pages, which was mimicked to some degree with a cover flow view of SearchMe, where I guess they cached a lot of the pages, but it was a very kind of appealing interface for flipping through graphical views of search results. I just noticed that I guess they closed this summer. I was looking to see what they were currently doing to prepare, and so I don't know what that means. Although there was an interesting argument in the VC. One of the VCs said that for people browsing the web on their TV screens, this might be a better view because you won't be able to see the text very well. So I thought that was an interesting thought. So I think the jury's out on visual views of web pages. But on the other hand, of course, the page hasn't been designed to be seen from afar. It's designed to be seen at reading distance. So it's not really clear if this is the right way to go, except for maybe browser history to recognize pages you've already visited. Okay, and finally, future trends in search interfaces. So this is the fun part where we get to speculate and you can argue with me. So I talk about I've kind of changed a little bit in this, but 4 main things in my book in the final chapter. So I think one direction is longer, more natural queries, and elaborate on that. Another is better mobile interfaces, which everyone is saying, but I think audio or spoken queries are going to become increasingly important, and perhaps spoken results. Social and collaborative search, which I'll talk a bit more about. And then longer term, video and audio will be dominating text for the general public. And then in the far future, maybe conversational interactions, but that's far off. So first, longer, more natural queries. Something I emphasize in the book, because I believe it was true, so I looked hard to find evidence to support my belief, was that when people are very new to search, like children or just people that have never done search before, so you have to go back to 97 or whatever, those papers, they initially approach search engines by typing in a full question. And also, Ask Jeeves was very popular in the early days of search, even though it never really answered questions. People liked that idea. And that I've always held on to that. Every time you saw someone talk about Ask Jeeves, it was, I really like the idea of being able to ask a question. Now, we moved away from that because we could only really support keyword queries well, and that made sense. Technology didn't support long queries. But the pendulum is swinging back. Sophisticated users of web search engines type long queries now, and Google and other search engines support it well. Some do, some don't. And Google's even going from the full conjunction, every word in your query has to be in the page or the anchor text, and they're relaxing that constraint some now for longer queries. And as far as I can tell, anyway. And also, the average query length continues to improve. I think it's pretty close to 3 now, which it didn't used to be, depending on whose statistics you look at. So even for everyday queryers, the query length's getting longer. And another interesting phenomenon is that information worded as questions is appearing more and more on the web from social question answering sites and forums. So, for example, if I type, how do I make a PB&J, Google's pretty smart about expanding that out to peanut butter and jelly somehow. But you also see matches of various forms to this question-like question, including video hits, which is new, which I liked. So you can ask how do I questions on the web and also often find answers. And of course, for us technical folks who are always looking for how to do something with software, you tend to write very long queries to try to figure out how to program something. And you find the hits in the forums that discuss how to program various systems. And so I'm recommending to people that they try to write their web pages with more conversational language to make it more likely to get hits like this. And this is just the beginning. I think this is where people want to go. And of course, it is more typing, which is a negative, but then once it's a spoken interface, then it's really easy to say things as questions. And I see that as really an important phenomenon, an important trend that's going to be increasing if the search engines will support it. Then social search. I talk about social ranking here. Also in Chapter 9 on personalization, I talk about related things. So there's different ways that people are expressing recommendations to others. In some cases, it's explicit recommendations like Dig or Stumble Upon, where you vote on something you read and you say you like it, you want others to see you like it. Bookmarking sites like Delicious. Google's experimenting with Search Wiki, where people move the ranking around on their pages. I don't know how you guys are using it. I'd like to see a paper. It'd be nice to see. But then there's also implicit recommendations. So click through. If you click on a search result in response to a query, that gets used to improve ranking algorithms. Places like Amazon.com, of course, have made very popular the people who bought this item also bought that, where you are making a recommendation to other people whether you want to or not, just by your actions. And then there was Yahoo's MyWeb, which is defunct, but now seems to be reproduced in Google Social Search, where you have a network of friends, and people that have marked certain web pages as being interesting can show up in your search results if those people are in your social network. That hasn't taken off yet, but I think it's intriguing. It kind of makes the web feel like a more friendly place, I think, if you see that people you know have looked at this page. Whether or not they really recommended it explicitly, it's sort of interesting to know that. So those are directions. I think that moving that way may or may not happen importantly. Another aspect of social search that I just mentioned is people expressing things in everyday language and having better hits when the queries are expressed that way. But another trend that's a little different is that's happening just in HCI generally is research on collaborative X, where there's really a recognition that people work together, and they work together either remotely or in person when using computers, but software does not support that very well. Collaboration is very poorly supported, or really explicit collaboration on information objects. So collaborative search has been a bit of work on, I'll talk about. There's work on collaborative visualization as well. And I think this will be a trend in HCI going forward. So this is a nice diagram from a paper by Pickens et al. Comparing different collaborative search approaches. So in an old one by Z. Yates 97, somebody used a search engine, another person used a search engine, they each got results, these were compiled and listed. Maybe they were ranked somehow and then they were listed. So they're not really working together, they're working independently and the results are being compiled. In another case, there's two users using a GUI together and the results are shown to both of them. In another case, this is Morris, more recently, who's been looking at shared collaboration and search. There's two users, they're each using a GUI, they're talking to each other, and they can sort of see what each other's doing, but they get pooled results. The results aren't affected by what each other does, it just pools the results, but they are aware of what the other person is doing. And then a work by Pickens et al., which I think is really interesting, where there's two users, they're using two different types of interfaces, and what one user does affects the results shown in the other user's view, and the algorithm actually in a very sophisticated way adjusts what it's showing. So here I have some pictures from their papers. So these, first of all, this is sort of the setup where there's two people here, they've got these big screens, and they see, they're actually doing video search, and they see different views. And, what are we doing on time here? Okay. So then this is one view. One of the people sees this view where they're kind of looking through a lot of stuff and weeding out things. And then the other view sees the results of the weeding out and scans through and looks more carefully. And they have kind of a diagram about how to make it work together, where the ranking really is affected by the actions of each person. And I think that's really interesting, and I think that's a really great direction to explore in the future, really supporting real collaboration. And it's not done much yet. There's also work, Jeff Hare is now at Stanford, formerly Berkeley, on trying to let people collaborate remotely on visualizations and making sense of numerical data. And I just think this is an upcoming trend. I have this whole thing on the decline of text, where I think the cultural heavy lifting in America is switching from text to video and audio. You just see that everywhere. For one thing, Pew shows the use of video sharing sites doubled from 2006 to 2009. You guys, of course, are aware of that here with YouTube. But something I find really interesting is this notion of a video response that seems to have just arisen organically at YouTube. I mean, I never would have thought of a response to a video with a video, which is it just shows that video is becoming more of a way to communicate. You edit, explore, like the way we use text and language. When the videos were used for the presidential debates with CNN and YouTube, it might have been the ones that were chosen, but rather than using the video medium in some really interesting way, most of the people just pointed the video at their face in their living room, said their question. I mean, it wasn't much more than an emailing in a question, except you get the demographics and the emotional kind of aspects. But the fact is that video is becoming a mundane way to communicate, like a text in some sense. And of course, videos can go viral much more than text. It seems like when you see the very popular videos have millions or tens of millions of views, whereas very popular articles don't have anywhere that number of hits typically. Pew also released a report showing that marketing emails that promised a podcast were 20% more likely to be opened than those that didn't, because people want to consume information that way. Movies with subtitles do poorly in the U.S. People don't want to read. And, it pains me to say this as a scholar and someone who just wrote a book with 100,000 words in it, but that's the way things are going. Yes?
You said this is the part where we can disagree with you?
You could disagree with me in any part, but this is the most controversial thing I say.
So I completely agree with the rise of video and audio, but if you look at things like Twitter, people love reading, people love text, and I actually think there's more text in use than ever.
So you brought up Twitter, and I think that's an interesting counter trend. So Twitter and texting are getting more popular than ever, and I think that's partly because of the privacy for the texting, especially with kids. You don't make noise, so you can do it in class, you can do it here. Twitter the same. But if there were some kind of a noise-canceling microphone where you could say things and people didn't hear and you made no noise, I bet people would do it in audio rather than typing, and I bet the kids would too. And if you could consume it, and again, in a way that wasn't noisy, and I think it's really about not disturbing others, and that people would prefer to say it orally, but of course that doesn't exist, so I can't prove it, but yeah.
I love the points that you bring up. Do you think that it's not about audio or video, it's not about texting, it's like some of the things that you were saying before, it's just moving towards a more naturalistic interaction and something beyond text right now, which requires full cognition, to move to something that you can do that's private, you can do in parallel.
Yeah, so the question is this more of this larger trend of moving to more naturalistic interaction? Because text in some sense is artificial. Text is artificial. We have to spend years teaching children how to read. A lot of people are dyslexic. It's natural cognitive property to do symbol mapping for humans, but reading is a very effortful thing. And I think that is part of the larger point, is that it's more natural to interact visually, orally. And in fact, I also think in the developing world, this could be a way of leapfrogging the literacy problem. If audio, video devices were very easy to edit, search, and produce and respond to via these media, then the literacy probably will lag even more, but people will be more empowered. So that's kind of a controversial thing to say. I'm not saying if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm saying I think technology might support that happening. And so the role of text and search in those areas might be different too.
You made the claim that because the video is going up so much, it must be at the decline of text. You could also imagine it's the decline of television.
It might be the decline of television, the video going up.
It wasn't television, not necessarily a text.
I think what's television and what's the internet is going to blend. I mean, I don't know if there's a real distinct difference, but I will say that one of the other distinctions that I make elsewhere is when you talk about Web 2.0 and the rise of the participation society, I think that's reflected in reality TV. And it's why comedy, scripted stuff is in the decline and reality TV is in the increase. It's that it's a multi-way interaction, and reality TV is kind of like a way for everybody to interact, not everybody, but more people. American Idol, that sort of thing. I have a whole essay on this, I have a different talk about the Web 2.0 stuff. But and the New York Times, someone editorial in the New York Times just made a point that news websites are starting to look more like TV. That you first get the video, you have to work hard to find the text, because that is what people seem to prefer. It's not what I prefer, but it's what a lot of people prefer. And I think the only thing holding that back more is we don't have really good ways to search video and audio. Audio is easier than video. Video, not really. It's still a little hard to edit, and it's hard to scan. It's still hard to scan. So once those are fixed, and then the quietness thing is fixed, I think except for lawyers and academics, I don't know. I think it's going to be greatly reduced. But that's controversial, and it's meant to be. And then finally, the far future trend is dialogue. We're still far from that, although the Siri tool is promising. It's based on real state-of-the-art, huge research projects supported by the intelligence community and the defense community, where they're pulling out the best of that stuff, and they're going to try to do more of a context-based, kind of a typical recommender thing, where where do you want to have breakfast? But it's a step in that direction, and I think that researchers in academia ought to start thinking more about this. How do you really do a dialogue, do that back and forth? It's not an easy to solve problem, but I think that that's the far future. And with the audio and so on, even more so. So not so much. I am pretty skeptical about the personalization for various reasons. I don't know if I have time to go into that. We could talk about it in the question. Let's see, I'm at 11 now. And with visualization, I think we need breakthroughs. People want it, but I don't know that it's going to happen. Maybe it's just going to be some kind of scanning of video instead. So thank you for listening. And feel free to go to the site if you want to read the book or buy it online. Thanks. I have time for questions. I know if people have to leave, feel free. It's 11, so yeah.
Question from New York?
Okay, go Josh.
Is there a question out?
Thank you.
Yeah, I can't hear very well.
Hi. Hi, is that better?
Yeah.
Great. So I I heard an article this past weekend on the subject of enhanced reality, augmented reality. And I started thinking about search in the context of augmented reality, and I wonder if you've thought about that.
Yeah, search in the context of augmented reality. I've always been much more, I don't know if I can look at you and talk in the mic at once. Can you see me? No? Yeah? I've always been much more, I've always thought augmented reality made a lot more sense than virtual reality, which I always thought was a bad idea. Although actually I've rethought that a bit with the notion of Second Life and kind of having a way to do kind of conferences across the world at once, so I'm rethinking that some. But augmented reality, where you project computation on the world around you, makes a lot of sense. And in fact, for years in the Chi community, we've talked about, you hold up your device, you're in a foreign country or an unfamiliar place, you hold up your device, you point it at a building, and then your phone tells you what the building is, its history, and all that. And we're very close to that now. It's amazing how rapidly that's developed. And, just that makes a lot of sense to me. So it's context sensitive, reacts to what's around the person. I also have always thought small devices were not going to be the final thing. I always thought, well, it's going to be a projected display where you can see it bigger and a projected keyboard so you can type on it. Although I'm amazed by how really useful the iPhone screen is. I actually am amazed what I can do on it. But I do think people are going to want it to be a little bigger, but not physically bigger. But yeah, augmented reality makes a lot of sense for search. Now the question is, I guess that's not search. I guess it's kind of search in that I see a building and the implicit searches tell me about the building I'm pointing at. Search in, I've seen people do search where they have blocks and you project words on the blocks and you rearrange them to make a conjunction or something. That makes no sense to me. That should just be virtual. It doesn't make it faster to put it on a physical thing. So I don't know. Do you have thoughts on it?
Well, I was thinking in terms of, the sort of canonical augmented reality application is you're walking down the street with your device, and your device knows where you are and what you're looking at, and what businesses in the area you care about, and what's on sale there, and when the movie schedule is, and so forth. And it implies essentially a collection of agents that are actively going out and getting information for you before you ask for it, so that they can either push it to you or when you ask for it, they already have it.
I just feel like we kind of already have that at this point. When I use my iPhone and I use the Maps function and I type in, restaurant, it sort of shows me. And yeah, I guess maybe it could just know that I want to see restaurants right now. That part I don't know how it would know. But I feel like 10 years ago we talked about this and it was this wild dream, and then we kind of have it now in some sense. If you have the map tool, it knows where you are when you ask for restaurants. If you ask for haircuts, it just looks it up right now. Google Maps does it. So.
It seems to me we ought to be able to take it. I agree with you that what we were talking about as a wild dream 10 years ago, we are very close to having now. And mostly it's a matter of commercializing and productionizing at this point. But it seems like we ought to be able to take that platform a step further and make it easier for people to get information when they need it.
I think so, and I think people are getting more creative ideas every day about how to take it the next level to anticipate what you want. But it's not going to anticipate I'm having a conversation with my friend and they make some claim that I know is wrong and I want to look it up and prove it to them. And then it could be based on what we were saying. Maybe it would save me the typing. But that's not a terrible burden to have to type that stuff or say it. So yeah, but I agree. I think I didn't even mention it because I guess it's less the focus of what I've been talking about in the book, but it's amazing what's been happening now with this sort of context-sensitive information retrieval that's relevant. Yeah. Yes?
I like your comments about the sort of blurring of the different kinds of forms, video, audio, search, text. So, as an author who just wrote 100,000 words, Why did you choose to do something so traditional as a book?
Well, I wrote this essay because I write once a year. I'm asked to answer a question for edge.org. I have the URL down there at the bottom. Because it was sort of, what's something that's going to happen whether you want it to happen or not? It's sort of an inevitable trend or something. And so then I have to answer that question. This is what I saw. So I don't necessarily like it, but I see it coming. I prefer to read, and I don't like to sit through videos myself, but I'm old, right? The other thing is, of course, there are some things you can express with text that you can't express in video, at least right now. But I also think the practices are going to change of how we do audio and video. Having video responses, that's a new thing. When were there video responses before in the history of the world? And really just the sharing of them and so on. So I actually think practices in technology are going to evolve and change very rapidly in the audio and video domains. And like I said, the thing that I've imagined, this noise-canceling way of speaking, doesn't exist. I've never heard anyone talk about it, but it seems like something you really need to move this way, and so probably somebody will invent it. And so, yeah. Just because, and I talk about the cultural heavy lifting, which is actually a phrase I got from Jeff Nunberg when he read a version of this essay, that it's not going to be for everything, but for standard communication among people as opposed to the more erudite, academic kinds of communication. And believe me, in academia, we're being encouraged to use video as, to keep people's attention. It's more explanatory for some things. We use diagrams and cartoons. And in fact, this is a very text-heavy talk, and I'm very self-conscious about it because I try to give a lot of my talks in a more visual manner, but it takes a lot of time to get all the images, and I am trying to talk about things that are more abstract in this particular talk. But of course, the way to give PowerPoint now is to have impressionistic images and speak over them and so on, and that's another reflection of this phenomenon, I think. Once you start thinking about it, you're seeing it everywhere in modern forms of communication. Peter?
Well, first I want to say that the online version is a little bit non-traditional, and like the mouse over references.
Yes.
Is really useful.
Yes. I don't know if I have internet here, so I can't show
The real
it.
question is, what would the theory say should be the differences in certain interfaces between a established player that has, say, 70% share and is trying to hold on to their users and make it better for them, versus a new player that has, say, 90% share and trying to track the users and how does reality reflect this?
Oh, that's a hard question. Well, first of all, I'll just say that Peter pointed out that the online version of my book is not just flat text. I have the references pop up when you mouse over them. And when you click on it, actually, it takes you to the reference list, which has a search button on it. When you click on that, it takes you to Google Scholar. If you click on that, you get the page, the document, which I found very useful preparing for this talk. I was using it myself to get screenshots of images of stuff. So yeah, I try to make it more interactive than a typical book, although I didn't go overboard. The second question is trying to innovate in the interface. If you're an established player, you can't upset people by making radical changes necessarily, or putting a little bit of words in your mouth. So what's the balance between someone that has, say, 70% market share and someone who's maybe starting out with 9%, and how you can innovate in the interface? Well, I was hoping to show SearchMe as an example of something that was thriving that way. Unfortunately, they're defunct. I guess they were working during a recession. They were focusing on a catalog kind of thing, which I didn't think made sense. I thought that the visual thing was a smarter thing to focus on. But I don't have the answer to that. I mean, one of the things they said is they can't play the server game. So right now there's a barrier to entry, and that if you don't have all the servers to do the big crawls and serve the fast queries, you can't compete. And I think that's a very serious problem. It wasn't true about search, 6 or 7 years ago. I thought anyone could hop in the market. Now it's not true. So it doesn't necessarily matter what you've got in your WYSI interface if you can't serve up all of the information. And we have this problem with biotext, our search for bioscience journal articles, in that we're showing the figures, so we can only do this for articles that are fully open access, legally available for us to download and serve up the images. So we'll never be a popular search engine because you have to have every article in Medline to be a viable bioscience search engine, plus you need to have all the other stuff. You need to have the document conversion, the email. You need to be full service before anyone's going to really adopt your stuff. That's true of a lot of things, email and any places you want to innovate. So I think now what you have to do is innovate in the interface and get bought. And it's not ideal. It's the way a lot of software industries are now, and it's it's very hard to satisfy the wide range of users, right? So maybe it has to be the innovation happens in these more specialized search engines like NextBio, where they're innovating in some really nice ways. Maybe that's where most of the innovation has to be. Maybe it can't be in the major search engines because you are serving so many people. And all has shown that search interfaces as they are, the standard ones, are too complicated for some users. Elderly people don't necessarily understand the URL. The little cache thing is confusing, and there's legacy stuff like that in there. So, whether you're serving a very wide audience, you don't have a lot of flexibility. So I don't blame search engine. In fact, that's why I put that up, and then I said, why is it hard? Because I'm not blaming anyone for keeping it simple. It's probably the right thing to do for web search. I don't know if I think you, kind of addressed it. Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to stick around for lunch. Thank you, guys.